David Galindo. I'm the director of the Water Quality Division here at TCEQ. And so today we're going to be talking about the delegation process that was required of us by House Bill 2771. And so we're going to be seeking delegation from the EPA on several oil and gas related waste streams to authorize for those waste streams for discharge under our TPDES program. So I'm very glad all of y'all could join us today. It's a good turnout. We are new to oil and gas, and so your input is very important to us. And so we're learning very quickly, as fast as we can. But the more information, the more input that the stakeholders can provide to us, the better off, the stronger program that we'll have. And so with that, I wanted to introduce Commissioner Emily Lindley to do our welcomes and introductions.
Thanks, David. Good morning. I recognize a lot of faces. There's also a lot of faces I don't recognize, which is fun. It's fun to see new folks up at the TCEQ, or maybe just new to me. So welcome. All I really will add on to David's comments, because I thought they were spot on, is that in order to get this done and to get it done in a way that EPA will approve, is if we communicate, and if we communicate well. So give us feedback. These folks, and I'll rattle off who they are here real quickly, are great. You've got the best of the best working on this. Laurie L doesn't let things fall through the cracks. She gets stuff done. So we're going to get this done. But in order for us to get it right, we're going to need to know what y'all are thinking and why you're thinking that. And I'm always a resource to all of you as well. I can't talk about permits usually, and I can't talk about enforcement actions, but rule actions I can speak about. And I want to be informed on this. I'm making myself available to staff and hopefully not getting in their way to help push this forward. So real quick, let me do a few quick introductions. Y'all all know Laurie L. She's going to speak in a minute. Laurie L is our top dog in the Office of Water. I always like to brag on Laurie L whenever I get an opportunity to do that. This is really cool. She's an engineer, and she was the first African-American female to graduate from UT's aeroscience program. She's pretty grad. So y'all have got her leading this team, so you're in good hands. Let me recognize Charles McGuire real quick, our special VIP here today. Charles, if y'all don't know him, is the person you really need to know in this whole process. He is the director of the Office of Water for EPA Region 6. So we have already been talking with Charles. Charles knows how important this is for Texas. He's a Texan, so he gets it. But I encourage you to introduce yourself to him at some point this morning if you don't already know him, because Charles will ultimately be giving us the thumbs up, thumbs down, and he is very committed to working with us and making sure this gets done for the state as well. So that was David Galindo. David Galindo is our director of the Water Quality Division, who oversees all the TPDES permits. I don't know if you're going to introduce all your staff or not. I'll let Mark is here. Mark works for him as well. Jocelyn is here. There's a couple people here from his division. Up here we have Laurie Fleet, who I think is going to be overseeing, I guess, the rule package. She works in the Water Quality Division. Todd Gallagher, y'all probably all know Todd. He works in our legal division. So he'll be the attorney on this matter. And then Melissa Cordell from our Office of Compliance and Enforcement, who's also going to have a big, compliance enforcement is going to be a big part of this rule package, because EPA wants to make sure that if they delegate a program to us, we can enforce it. So they're a big part of it. So with that, I will give the mic back to, I'll give it to Laurie L. Again, consider me a resource. Consider everyone here a resource. If you have questions, this is something I want to be engaged in, and I want to have conversations about. So please call me. Please reach out. And if you don't know Martha, my senior advisor who just is up here in the front, I encourage you to introduce yourself to her. She can always track me down if you need me. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. And I have to say, Commissioner Lindley has been interested in this topic, right when the bill was introduced, and soon after the bill was issued, she wanted to meet with us to find out what was going on and what she could do to help. So we really appreciate her leadership with this. And I'm Laurie L Stephanie, Deputy Director for the Office of Water. My part on the agenda is to talk about our communication with EPA, delegation of the program, as well as kind of our team that we have working on it. I'll also mention that, and I can get some staff to walk around with these. If any of you guys need an agenda, we have copies. And so if you raise your hand, I'll have somebody if you need one, or if you're good. Okay. Thank you, Cyrus, for coming and grabbing one.
Does anyone want one?
We'll pass them around. Mark, do you mind? Just raise your hand while Mark walks around. Okay, great. So one of the first things that I did after the bill was passed, I talked internally with a couple of our my counterparts in the different offices, because delegation, I don't know if many of you realize this, but delegation is not only permitting, but it's also enforcement. And so David and I sat down and we talked about, hey, we need a team of people who can be our brain trust, a group of people who will handle, you know, our core processes. And so we formed a team with Office of Water, David Galindo's permitting folks. We have the Office of Legal Services, and Todd Gallagher is here representing them. We have the Office of Compliance and Enforcement, and Melissa is here with OCE, as well as Susan Jablonski, and Romero Garcia's shop is also kind of leading the effort with David. And then once we get delegation, there's still some coordination that, even before we get delegation, there's some coordination that we have to do with our sister agency, Railroad Commission. And so, you know, it's quite a bit to move a program from one agency to the other. There's tons of logistics, you know, from the files, the paper files, to the electronic files, to standard operating procedures. There's quite a list, and we have some experience with that with some of the other transfers that we've done, but that's a part of our project plan as well. And I know I think it's Laurie or David's going to go over our project plan, basically. So be assured we have a team of people, group of people, core group from all the offices that are going to talk to each other regularly, meet to discuss our plans to make sure we're on track. And there's Susan, who just walked in. Hi, Susan. Next, one of the things I wanted to talk about, and Charles and I have been talking, Charles from Region 6, have been talking quite a bit about this component, and we wanted to raise it with stakeholders because we think it's a very critical question in the question of delegation that we are actively exploring with EPA. Actually, Toby Baker, myself, and Stephanie Bergeron-Purdue, Toby's the executive director, Stephanie's the deputy executive director, are going actually up to Washington to meet with David Ross this Friday. And on our agenda, we're going to put this particular question on the agenda, and it's regarding partial delegation. EPA, the attorneys at EPA have raised questions about, are we seeking partial delegation of a program? So HB 2771, it basically was very specific. Produced water, hydrostatic test water, and then also gas plant discharges would move over from the Railroad Commission to TCEQ. EPA is concerned about just having those three components of the whole oil and gas universe move over, although they're the biggest components, and the other components are really small. But in our initial discussions, and Charles was gracious enough to arrange a conference call with us to kind of explain the concern. But EPA would like us to take the whole thing, the whole, a major category. So that would be oil and gas. And so what that means in their world is there's SIC codes that you traditionally see that are responsible for, are associated with produced water or gas plants, or everybody does hydrostatic testing. And so, but there's some other SIC codes that handle some other constituents and other activities under the oil and gas umbrella. Now, I don't think the oil and gas umbrella is defined anywhere, but there's some SIC codes that they believe fit underneath that major category. And so they believe we should take it all. So questions that come up, you know, well, do we have statutory authority to take it all? We wouldn't be opposed to doing that, but also, are we really required under the federal rules or the Clean Water Act? Is this really a partial delegation? So our attorneys, Todd, wave your hand. Todd has looked at it for us, and our current interpretation is that we've already received partial delegation when we got the delegation for the rest of the TPDS program back in 1998. And so this would just be a revision of the program. So Section 402N of the Clean Water Act would not apply because, again, this is just an update to what we already have. Secondly, even if it were to apply, there's a part in there that says an agency can apply for delegation for everything under their jurisdiction. And since those big three major waste streams have been moved over to the agency upon delegation, we believe that we would even meet that test. So we don't think it's an issue, but EPA has raised it as a significant issue that we need to visit about. And we wanted to let all of the stakeholders know that that's one of the critical elements that we think we need to resolve as quickly as possible so that we're clear with EPA as to what needs to go in that delegation package so that there are no stumbling blocks to approval. So we're going to be looking at that with them. The other idea I think we had is, you know, produced water isn't really defined. So maybe those little itty bitty small numbers of other permits that EPA issue that fall under the I guess virtual oil and gas umbrella, maybe they really are associated with produced water. So we're looking at that as well. But we wanted to, again, raise that for the stakeholders so that you knew that that was a significant issue that has been raised. I think the other thing that we're looking at as far as EPA is concerned is how far offshore to go. 3 miles, 9 miles. Currently for TPDS, we go out 3 miles. But for oil and gas, EPA goes all the way out to 9. So we just need to talk about how far offshore our delegation package needs to cover. So we're looking at that as well. I think that was it. Questions before I move on? Okay. Yes, Dean.
The things you may not be taking with partial delegation, if that in fact is what it is, at the Railroad Commission still, or
No, it's off. There we go. Thank you. We've talked to Railroad, and they've given us a list of other smaller types of wastewaters that they deal with. It's a long list, but there's not a huge universe. And so those would be at Railroad if we can't find a way to incorporate those into the move over to TCEQ. EPA has given us a list of SIC permits that they've issued in the last 3 years. Charles, what is it, about 52-ish? And we're talking about a small number of permits that fit into these other categories, 4 or 5 in each of the different SIC codes. So it's a really small number, but as I understand from EPA, they would like for us to take everything, again, under the virtual oil and gas umbrella. So my term. Questions? Okay. David. Who's next? Todd.
Good morning. Again, I'm Todd Gallagher, Senior Attorney for Water in the Environmental Law Division at the TCEQ. And before I get started, I just want to recognize 2 of my team members that are also on this project that are here in the room today, Kathy Humphreys and Stephanie Scogan. They have both already been doing a lot of work on this, particularly on this partial delegation question. Stephanie has done a lot of research on that question, so I want to recognize her for that. This morning, I'm going to be talking to you about 2 issues. First one is the bill that's requiring the delegation, and second, a little bit about what's involved in applying to the EPA for delegation for these programs. Okay, first, the reason we're all here this morning, House Bill 2771 passed in the last session, which amended the Water Code, Section 26-131, if you're interested in looking up at what in the statute was changed. And this bill says that upon delegation by EPA, TCEQ may issue discharge permits for 3 different categories of discharges: produced water, hydrostatic test water, and gas plant effluent. And the bill also specifies that upon delegation by EPA, the following will be transferred from the Railroad Commission to the TCEQ. First, the powers, duties, functions, and programs related to those 3 types of discharges. Any obligations or contracts directly related to implementing one of those transferred functions, and all property and records of the Railroad Commission that's related to a duty that's transferred by the bill. Under the bill, our deadline to submit this petition requesting delegation, deadline to submit it to the EPA is September 1st of 2021, a little less than 2 years from now. And one thing to keep in mind as we get closer to that date is that under the bill, it specifies that the changes made by that bill will apply to applications that are pending at the Railroad Commission on the date of delegation. So if an application is pending at that agency, it will be transferred to this agency in process on the date of delegation. And as far as putting together the delegation package that we have to submit to the EPA, there are different elements that are required to be included in that submittal. One thing is a governor's letter, a formal request from the governor's office requesting EPA delegate that program to the Texas through the TCEQ. We have to have a memorandum of agreement with the EPA. We already have an agreement between the 2 agencies that we had entered into in 1998 when we first got TIPT's delegation. So our plan with this project is not to revise that entire document, but to just do an addendum that will cover the oil and gas functions that are being transferred over. One of the big parts of the submittal that we have to submit is called a program description, and that includes several different elements. It has to include a narrative description of the program and how we intend to operate it. And that description also has to include organizational structure of the agency, description of the employees that will be involved in it and the number of employees. We have to describe or give an estimate of the cost, we think, how much it will cost to implement and run this program for the first 2 years after delegation. And we also have to give an estimate of how we're going to pay for those costs for the first 2 years. Including the source of any funding, any grants or fees or agency funding that will be used to support that program. One of the other things, the major components we have to submit is also a description of our compliance and enforcement process. Make sure that we have authority to enforce that process with EPA. We have to demonstrate to EPA how we're going to enforce that, this new program. And that's something that Melissa will be telling you a little bit about later this morning. We also have to include what's called the Attorney General Statement. That's a certification by the Attorney General's office that we have sufficient legal authority under state statutes and agency rules that we'll be required to adopt to carry out and implement this program. And then finally, we have to submit a copy of all the underlying statutes and regulations to the EPA that will be involved in these 3 programs that are being sought for delegation. Once we submit the petition to EPA, they have 30 days to determine if it's a complete submittal. After that, once they make that determination, they have 90 days to approve or deny our request, but that deadline can be extended by agreement between the 2 agencies. There is some public participation that goes along with a delegation request. EPA must publish notice of this petition in the Federal Register and in the largest newspapers in the state to make sure the public is aware of that they're considering our request. They're required to allow a comment period, to allow any member of the comment to submit comments on our request and our proposal. And then there's an option for the EPA to hold a public hearing after the notice has been published in the Federal Register. That wraps up, basically kind of covers what we will be doing for the next 2 years as getting ready for this project. And with that, I will turn it over to Laurie.
Good morning. So I recognize that this particular slide may be difficult to read, but I think the overall just visual of the number of tasks on the left side of the screen show not even a complete picture, but really just from today's date down through submitting the application. As Laurie L mentioned, in addition to these, there's also that coordination between us and the Railroad Commission for things like records, paper records, electronic records, which are not on this slide. This basically shows the task that we need to accomplish to get from today to submitting our application to EPA. And the biggest visual that you'll notice is that a number of these like sub-projects are lengthy. Rulemaking here at the agency can take about a year to a year and a half. So one of the first things we have to do is adopt the oil and gas effluent limitation guidelines in 40 CFR Part 435. That rulemaking project has already been started. We are drafting that rule now, and we anticipate taking that to proposal in December of this year, and then going to our commissioners for adoption of that rulemaking in May of next year. And so while that's going on, you'll notice that we have our enforcement initiation criteria revision going on. That's an enforcement document that lays out how they initiate enforcement actions. That's going to be running parallel with the rulemaking. We have a hydrostatic test general permit that currently authorizes hydrostatic test wastewater discharges both into water in the state and adjacent to water in the state, which is like land application. Right now, that permit is going through its renewal process. We anticipate wrapping that renewal up in April of next year, and as soon as that renewal is completed, we can initiate an amendment. We would really like to roll the hydrostatic test discharges from this bill into that general permit. Our general permits are, David's going to go through our permitting process, but general permits are a much less labor-intensive process to get your authorization as well as workload for us. So we would like to be able to roll the hydrostatic test discharges into that general permit. But again, we're going to have to wait until our current renewal that's open right now gets completed before we can initiate the renewal. Yes, the presentation will be posted online after the meeting. In addition to renewing that hydrostatic test general permit, we're going to be revising our memorandum of understanding with the Railroad Commission. That's actually a two-step process. You'll notice that Railroad Commission is going to revise it, and then the next one underneath that is TCEQ adopting that memorandum of understanding. So those, rather than being concurrent projects, have to be more in parallel. So Railroad Commission will need to revise it, and then we'll adopt it. So those are going to be two tasks that we'll have to watch really closely because we can't be working on them concurrently. One is dependent upon the other. And then once we get all of that, those things in line, then we're going to be starting on our MPDS delegation application. All those components that Todd talked about, getting all of those in order, putting fingers on a keyboard and typing it all out. So that's going to be happening. We're going to be revising the memorandum of agreement, or I should say, not revising, as Todd mentioned. We don't plan to touch our current memorandum of agreement, but rather do an addendum, just like an addition to that current document. So we'll be drafting that. We have to have our application and the draft memorandum of agreement in place in order to submit it to our Attorney General's office, because they will be looking at all of the information that we have in our application, as well as the statutory authority, our rules, which again are part of that application, to make that legal determination that establishes that we have the legal authority to implement the program. So all of these activities are going to have to be in place before we can submit it to the Attorney General's office. Once we have the Attorney General's opinion, legal authority opinion, we can submit the packet to the Governor's office for that cover letter to officially request that delegation from EPA. And then ultimately, it'll be submitted to EPA to begin that review period on their end. So, like I said at the very beginning, this is our preliminary schedule. We're still in the information gathering process. And so I just wanted to note that some of these timelines may be adjusted over time. As we learn more information, we may be able to do some of these things more concurrently, maybe go a little faster, some may go a little slower. As we learn more information about all of these moving parts and steps that have to occur, some of these timelines may be adjusted. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk about our permit applications and our permitting process that we currently have.
Okay, before we move on, did anyone have any questions about the implementation schedule? Cyrus?
Yeah, just, so one thing I don't see on your timeline is when you're scheduled to submit this to EPA is right at the time that the 2021 legislature is ending their session. And given that your application has to say how you're going to pay for it and how many staff you're going to need to implement it, is there any concern that the legislature either might not give you the funds needed to implement the program or might change something in the meantime, and could that affect the schedule at all?
I see Laurie L approaching.
I do think we're cognizant of the next session that's up, and we did get resources in this past session. We got 9 FTEs, 3 for permitting and 6 for OCE, and so and so that's a good question. I think what we'll do is write that one down. Mark is taking notes for us. Thank you, Mark. And then we'll visit with probably our budget folks just to make sure we're covered. And also, as we learn more through this process, if there's a need to revisit that, we can consider that through the session. But, we're mindful of it. And certainly, depending on how these discussions with EPA go as well, that could impact what happens in session.
I have one more question.
No, go ahead.
So my other question was about a parallel process that you guys will also be engaged in, and I don't know if it impacts this at all. Maybe it's more would impact in the future, which is you're also having to develop your 2021 water quality standards just for the surface waters of the state. Does anything in here impact what's in there, or would that be more for the 2024 water quality state? I'm not sure the timing of any of this, so I'm just wondering if that's something you have to keep in mind. Maybe it's a water quality division person, I don't know.
So yeah, we will be developing the water quality standards. I think it's 2021. I just talked to Laurie Hamilton about that yesterday. We don't think we'll have to make changes to the water quality standards, but certainly we can just double check that, because Railroad Commission follows our Texas water quality standards when they're issuing permits. So we don't think we'll have to make changes, but we'll certainly keep that in mind.
Okay. So I was going to go on to our permitting process. And so my understanding is that currently, for permitting purposes, for any discharge of hydrostatic test water, gas plant effluent, and produced water, it requires both a state authorization from Railroad Commission and then a federal authorization from EPA. And so TCEQ had gotten delegation for all other non-oil and gas related waste streams to permit those for discharge that covers both the federal authorizations and the state requirements, the Texas Water Code. And so we currently issue those permits, so we have a process in place, again, that satisfies all the federal effluent limitation guidelines. We apply those in our permits, as well as the water quality standards. And so our permit applications include the same information if you were going to EPA for a permit. The requirements in there for landowner information, discharge route. That information, those items are all spelled out within the federal regs under 40 CFR. I think it's 122. And so we have the same exact information. And so if you're familiar with that process of having to obtain an NPDES permit from EPA, some of this is going to be familiar. We have the site information that's required, notice information, so we'll need to know adjacent landowners for new facilities because there was a mailed notice for any new new permits or amendments to existing permits on the individual permit side. And so right now I'm just talking about the individual permits. There will be the opportunity to take advantage of general permits when we have a large class of similar operations that fit a general permit scenario like hydrostatic test. And so we also require information on your discharge location, your outfall location, so that we can perform the water quality modeling to ensure that dissolved oxygen in the receiving waters is protected. Also is important for our toxic screenings as well. And then affected landowner information. So that could also be if you're discharging to a perennial water body, you may have to identify folks a mile downstream of your discharge point because they would also be potentially affected by your discharge. So that covered most of the administrative items, and this is just very high level. I know we're first steps are having to get delegation before you would even be looking at having an application with us, but I wanted to cover these things because just to distinguish between the individual permits and the general permit, because I did want to talk a little bit about the existing hydrostatic test permit that we have and how we may be able to amend that. And so on our individual permit applications, you identify the types of wastewaters that that you'd be discharging, processed wastewaters, utility wastewater, stormwater. And so the permit writer will evaluate that, evaluate what your treatment processes are proposed. We also get effluent sampling data, laboratory analysis on the 160 priority pollutants required by NPDES permitting. So that includes, organics, acids, bases, there's pesticides in there. So there's a slew of chemicals that need to be analyzed by a NELAP certified lab and provided to us so that we could screen that effluent for water quality standards, for compliance with water quality standards. And again, receiving water information, it makes a difference the type of water body that you're discharging into, on what types of standards get applied or how that discharge is evaluated. And so we have a document called the implementation procedures. We call it the IPs. Essentially, it's the cookbook of how you go from the criteria for protection of human health and aquatic life, and how you can calculate an effluent limitation based on that criteria. So it's a great document to have to go along with your permitting. It'll explain how we determine whether a limit is needed in a permit. It's the implementation procedures, so it's the procedures to implement the Texas Surface Water Quality Standards. I believe it's RG 194 is the number. We also ask for information regarding any impoundments on the site, process, raw. On the raw side, the process, untreated. So your wastewater treatment, impoundment information. And then also for facilities that would be doing land application, which would be a state-only requirement, We have requested information on the area and the type of vegetation or crop that's going to be grown. The application comes in, gets an administrative review, so to evaluate, make sure all the adjacent landowners are properly identified. Goes to a technical review, so we'll again review the receiving water, the designated uses and the standards for those water bodies, and ensure that we're applying the standards correctly. For any renewals, we're looking at anti-backsliding requirements to ensure if there's a request for a less stringent provision in the permit, that request complies with anti-backsliding regulations. We also look at endangered species and identify those endangered species in those water bodies, and then those permits could then go on to be reviewed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they can provide input back to us on those permits, as well as Parks and Wildlife will often provide comments on endangered and threatened species. Mixing zones, we talked a little bit about identifying why it's important to identify your outfall location and the characteristics of that water body at the point of discharge, because we do conduct dispersal modeling. And so if your discharge is a small discharge going into a fast-moving water body, you do get some credit for that when we apply the toxics criteria. And again, all this is spelled out within that implementation procedures document, but just want to give you an idea of some of the things that we do when we evaluate permits for discharge. You look at dissolved oxygen, modeled dissolved oxygen to also ensure that the water body complies, or the water body maintains the designated uses. So if that is a high aquatic life use, then it may have a corresponding 5 milligram per liter dissolved oxygen level, and so we perform the modeling to ensure that discharge is compliant, as well as biomonitoring review, and again, TexTox is the water quality screening. So our draft permits may or may not be subject to EPA review. A large portion of them are subject to EPA review, and this could be triggered by endangered species, discharges to 303D impaired water bodies, most processed wastewater discharges like refineries, power plants, those types of discharges are subject to EPA review. Not sure what I did there. So that kind of covers individual permits. Individual permits are site-specific permits, discharge permits. General permits are good statewide. So if you're familiar with the hydrostatic general permit that EPA currently has, oh no, they do not currently have a hydrostatic general permit. So I think that might be why we're all here. So we do have a hydrostatic general permit for discharges for all the non-oil and gas pipes and tanks. Okay, sure.
First one, under existing law, if you're an oil and gas producer and you're west of the 35th meridian, there is a process where you can discharge wastewater for co-benefit for agriculture. Is that something you guys would, so first question, would you guys incorporate that somehow into this scheme, this delegation authority, or would that still be, or would that be a separate thing to the EPA, or would that be part of this program? That's first question. You want me to give the second question, or should I wait?
Yeah, hold on a second.
Okay.
So for the first question, we're going to be implementing everything that's currently implemented at the state level and at the federal level.
Okay.
So if that's required by the, under the...
There's the allowance for that to happen. It doesn't mean it will happen, and they have to obviously meet some standards, but I'm wondering if that would be anticipated. It's a question for you guys to look at.
Yeah, so it's also, there are some that are permitted that don't actually discharge, but they're land application. Is that correct? So those ones that are land application are just state only right now. And I'm not aware of anyone that's coming in or is proposing any discharges west of the 98th. And then they would also have to meet that provision, I believe, for it has to be a beneficial for a
I said
beneficial
35th, I meant 98th, sorry.
yeah. So yeah, for a discharge to occur, it also has to meet that requirement that it's for beneficial use for agriculture or livestock.
But that would be under your guy. You guys would be looking at those as part of this program.
Yes, we would.
Okay. And then second question is one of the concerns during the whole legislative process that was raised was the fact that there are chemicals used in the hydrofracturing process that don't currently have, specific standards. Are you going to be addressing that as, you mentioned obviously you're going to be testing for 160 different constituents, but the concern of a lot of the public is, are there chemicals that may be under trade secret that could impact human health and the environment that we don't even have standards for or haven't been really reviewed in terms of a constituent in a wastewater discharge permit? And are you guys going to be evaluating that at all as part of this process? Whether there should be additional tests for additional kinds of chemicals that might be present?
So maybe about 2 years back, EPA was actually going state to state to look at this question of whether or not they should expand their existing 435 regs or 437, the centralized waste treatment regs, to open up and start examining whether or not that 98th parallel prohibition is removed, which would open the door to potentially more wastewater discharges of produced water. So the purpose of going around talking to states about this was to get state input on whether or not they wanted EPA to open those back up and look into those questions of, okay, is 435 how it's currently structured, is that sufficient, or does new limitations, do they need to be added? They need to be added in order to protect water quality. And so that's something that they were looking at. I know that they haven't proposed anything definite yet on any changes, but that would be required to go through a rulemaking process, and so stakeholders would have the opportunity to give input. Yeah, and then we do a triennial revision of the water quality standards, and so if there are additional pollutants that get added or new criteria that gets proposed at the national level, then we look at those as well.
I wanted to follow up on your first question as well, Cyrus, about the water quality standards. Charles was great enough to remind me when I said Railroad Commission uses our water quality standards in their review. So does EPA. So both entities that currently issue the permits use our existing water quality standards. And so I think we should be good since both groups are using it, unless a new directive or new requirements come down from EPA. So we'll be looking for those, but there's nothing new right now. So,
Okay, so on to public participation. So it's required in the water code that we have 2 public notices that are mailed out, as well as the opportunity for public meetings and public hearings. And so we currently implement that in our TIPDs process. And so, there are 2 newspaper notices that go out for mailing in the county where the facility is located. And then there are opportunities for the public to request a public meeting. And a public meeting is different from a public contested case hearing. Public meeting is going to be where the agency sends staff out somewhere near the proposed facility and will take the public's comments on that application. Contested case hearings can be requested by affected parties, and then the commission would make the determination whether or not to grant a contested case hearing. If that hearing does get granted, then that permit would be referred over to State Office of Administrative Hearings, and it could be a 6-month to 9-month time frame for that hearing to take course. So on our general permits, a general permit, we have one master general permit, which outlines all the requirements that a discharge to be permitted, to be eligible for coverage under the general permit, and what those requirements are as far as effluent monitoring, what those provisions are. That's all included in the master general permit. Thanks. The applications for the general permit is called the notice of intent. The notice of intent is submitted to the agency where the applicant is confirming that they're eligible for coverage under the general permit and that they are going to comply with the requirements of the general permit. And so the process to apply for coverage under a general permit could be as quick as 24 to 48 hours processing of a notice of intent. So when EPA or TCEQ develops the general permit, we do this with stakeholder input, and then we also are required to get EPA review of that general permit and approval before we can issue it. But the stakeholder process, we put this general permit, a draft of the general permit available for public review, and then there is a public notification done. We notice the public that the general permit is out, and so we can get comments back on those. Yes, we do. And so there are public comments, public meetings, but there's no contested case hearing process on a general permit. So again, very streamlined process for the NOI to get coverage under the general permit. And so as I mentioned earlier, we currently have a hydrostatic general permit that covers new vessels or any containers that previously contained non-oil and gas related materials. And so currently anything that's under the Railroad Commission, we don't cover under our general permit. And so what we're currently, this permit is currently, it's gone through EPA review. We're in the final stages of renewing this general permit, and the current permit expires in April. And so we are moving to renew this permit, and then as quick as we can, we want to reopen the permit to include oil and gas related hydrostatic test water. So we want to get this permit as far along in the process as we can. So the idea is that if we can have this permit in place upon delegation, if we get delegation, that we'd be able to, that there wouldn't be a lag between Railroad Commission and TCEQ, that we'd be able to begin right away if that permit was approved. We'd be able to issue those or have applicants submit their notices of intent for coverage under the general permit. Yeah, I don't believe there's not a, currently the state doesn't have a general permit. Another thing to mention is when we previously had delegation, or when we obtained delegation in '98, we had state permits and federal permits for the same facilities. And as we wrote the TPDS combined permit, we would look to see, you'd have to look at the effluent limitations, and if they both had a copper limit, we went with the more stringent limitation. We applied that in the permit. So, you know, I imagine as we're going through this process with EPA on renewing this general permit, things that are different between how the state handles them and how EPA handles them, I'm sure we'll be discussing that with EPA. If they have, say, wet requirements on their side and the state didn't have those requirements, it's very likely that the general permit's going to have wet requirements that we propose for issuance, and then we would take comment on that. Okay, so when we previously got delegation from EPA on all the non-oil and gas waste streams, we had both a federal permit and a state permit for the same facility that essentially was identical permits, but they may have some differences in the effluent limitations or in the parameters. So if one permit had a more stringent effluent limitation or had a parameter that wasn't included on the other permit, those were rolled into the combined TIPDES permit. Okay, did that answer your question? Okay, thank you. And it's a 48-hour process to obtain coverage under the general permit. So we go through a long process of developing the general permit, and this permit has to be renewed every 5 years and reviewed by EPA every time we renew it. But the benefits are that once that permit is developed, it's the streamlined coverage. So currently in our hydrostatic just general permit, just to give you an idea of the effluent limitations that are in there, we have limitations for TPH, benzene, BTEX. We have 2 total lead, and they're location specific, and a pH limitation. And so at this point, well, does anyone have any questions about the hydrostatic general permit? And like I said, as soon as we can get this current one issued, we're going to start on the road of amending the other permit, and that would go out for public comment.
Requirements between a state permit versus a federal permit.
So could you be a little more specific? Is there a...
They're testing, for example, on a wet test, the state requires 1 time per year. The NPDES permit requires quarterly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same test.
Yeah. So I think we'll have to have discussions with EPA if we're rolling that into our permit now, because currently our permit doesn't have wet testing in it. And so if we were including wet testing, we'd have to have discussions with EPA on what the appropriate frequency would be, and then we would envision this to be for just the oil and gas portion of it, not to subject the previous permittees to the wet testing if they previously didn't have it in there.
There's not a current existing EPA general permit for hydrostatic discharge authorization. What would you be comparing your revised permit to when you're looking at the most stringent limits?
So they currently don't have one, but they previously had one, correct? So I'd imagine that although it's not renewed, that would be the expectation that we would meet that. But we'll have to discuss that with our attorneys, Todd. And yeah, we'll have to discuss that with EPA and find out how we'll approach that.
Hi, I have a question. Are you engaging regulators with other states within Region 6, for instance, New Mexico?
This is Emily again. Hi. Sorry for this awkward angle here. Oh, wait, I can do this. Here we go. Short answer is yes. I don't know. Yeah. So I'm in regular contact with the Secretary of the Environment for Oklahoma, and they are, I don't know how to say it, a few weeks ahead of us, maybe a step or two might be a good way to say it in the process. So we're in regular contact about what they're learning and how we might need to incorporate that in our application. And New Mexico is also going through it as well. I've just recently gotten to meet Secretary McQueen, McQueen. I did meet McQueen as well. And actually, in 2 weeks, I'm going up to Region 6, and I'll be talking to the new regional administrator, Kim McQueen, about it as well. But we're going to be working together, I guess, as much as we can. Probably more than anything, just sharing information between the three of us about how is it going, and you know, tips and that kind of thing. I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear, but that's kind of the short answer.
I have a quick question on your hydrostatic discharge permit. So, with your general permits can be a discharge directly to the water. Is that correct?
Well, we actually, our current permit has, you could either do direct discharge when you meet the effluent limitations, or there's some other requirements if you want to do land application.
Okay,
The land application, you wouldn't actually have to submit a notice of intent under our current process.
Okay, so that's where I was headed. Based on location and waters, I may want to do a land application or a discharge, which is what we currently do with Railroad Commission.
Yeah, we can definitely roll that into the general permit.
So along those lines, for a general permit for an actual discharge to a water body, might there be, depending on which water body it is and what kind of water quality standards it has, can you add specific provisions to a general permit to protect, you know, water bodies with higher aquatic life standards? Or, see what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Or would they then be subject to an individual permit because they wouldn't be able to use the general permit? Or how would that work?
Exactly. So if your discharge was, say, to a water body that was subject to a total maximum daily load, and you had the pollutant of concern there, and it was determined you could contribute to that impairment, that would be an individual permit scenario. Correct. Okay, so now we'll go on to fees with Laurie Fleet.
Travis. Hit the. It's okay. So our current process for assessing fees to support our program, we assess application fees. And so for our individual permits, the fees range from $1,215 up through $2,050. The maximum application fee that we can assess is established in the Texas Water Code, Chapter 5, I believe. So that's the application fee for an individual permit. For a general permit, because as David described, the permitting process is much more condensed and expedited because we've already established all of the requirements in the master general permit, and so you would just simply be seeking authorization to discharge under that master general permit. Because it's a much more condensed process, our application fees are much reduced. As you can see, for a general permit, it's only $100. Is that statutorily set, or that's for the general permit? That's set by the agency, but the maximum application fee for any of our authorizations is established in the statute. But it is reduced for the general permits for the purpose of an expedited process, because it's not taking us as long to go through that review process. We don't have to go through all of those reviews. It doesn't take us as much time. Time is money, so save y'all some money. For the annual fees, we do have our annual fees are established in the Water Code as well, but they're codified within Chapter 21, so it's 30 Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 21. And so any facility that is active on September 1 of each year will be assessed an annual fee. And those factors, again, are listed in Chapter 21. And it's based, essentially, just high level, it's based on things such as your flow volume, your toxicity rating, your pollutant loading. All of those factors go into establishing what that fee is. So it's not a one-size-fits-all fee. It really is specific to your discharge. About 75% of our industrial wastewater permittees pay something less than $10,000. There are some that have a higher fee, and again, it's based on those contributing factors. However, for our general permit, our annual fee and this is specific to our hydrostatic test general permit, is currently $100 per year. So are there any questions about our fees? Yes, ma'am. The general permit fee of $100 is specific to our hydrostatic test general permit. We have other general permits that may have different application fees and general permit annual fees. So those, for our general permit, that slide is specific to the hydrostatic test, our current hydrostatic test general permit.
Thank you.
Okay. And just to, so where do these fees go? So they go into a water resource management account, and that's what we use to support our program, both from a permitting perspective as well as the compliance and enforcement. So that's how those fees are used within the agency. Any other questions?
Is there a maximum on the individual annual fee? Is there a maximum set, like a maximum?
There is not a maximum annual fee. There's not a maximum annual fee. Again, it's based on those factors that are in Chapter 21, and then there's a multiplier. So there is a cap on the multiplier that we can use. I believe it's 1.75. So in the event that because our application fees are capped, in the event that we determine that we did not have sufficient funding to support our program, what we would likely do would be to increase that multiplier, which would be distributed across all permittees.
Y'all heard me up here whispering to Laurie. So is this just for the hydrostatic general permit? So I think what we'll have to do is, as we get more into the team process, we need to look to make sure that we have enough money to support the FTEs we got and to support the program that we got and all the overhead that goes along with that, you know, vehicles for the inspectors, stuff that we have to do. And so, and we'll look at our universe. We got some numbers from Railroad. We got some numbers from EPA, and we'll just have to see and work with our budget and planning folks and kind of see if most of our facilities are under the general permit, kind of see what the fee structure needs to be. I think most of them would be for hydrostatic testing, right? But we'll see. There could be more produced water discharges. And so this is what we currently have in place, and so we'll take a look at that as we learn more and go through the process.
And just to add on to this real quick, I meant to make this point earlier. This kind of follows up with the question you asked earlier, Cyrus. If we need more FTEs to run the program, whether it's in permitting or enforcement, if we need to change our fee structure, and if it's something that we need statutorily, that'll be our lift next session to do. And I assume we'll have a lot of input, I would hope, from the stakeholders in this room on that. And I know there's members, some staff on the ledge here today, so I know they're hearing this as well now. But you know, I'm committed to working on that with y'all, with them, and if we need to go make those asks, that's something I believe all the commissioners would be supportive of, and the executive director, and that's what we'll do if we need to do it come next session in order to get this thing packaged up in a way that EPA is happy with.
Laurie, for you.
That's all I had.
Okay, and so now we'll move on to compliance and enforcement.
He's going to turn me on. Can you hear me now? All right. I'm going to let you have that. And I'll hide behind this. I'm representing now the office that would work on compliance and enforcement here at TCEQ. And I'm going to have Melissa Cordell is covering how do you put in your DMRs, your discharge monitoring reports with the agency, as well as then if you end up in enforcement at the agency, which we hope that's not the case. So we did want to talk a little bit about the compliance side of the house, and I wanted first to mention that we do plan to do outreach, and we will be doing that through our public assistance program. And I don't know if we've got anybody here in the room today, but we'll definitely give you some points of contact for that. But before the actual transfer would occur and delegation authority would be granted, we would be doing outreach and providing guidance on what expectations are for compliance, so that you're not going into this not understanding the TCQ rules, that we're putting that in plain language to you, and you have an opportunity in another forum to ask questions. So be looking for that and make sure that you're on this stakeholder list so that we have your contact information, and when those things are provided in your parts of the state, that we can invite you to that as well. So as far as compliance and enforcement, we may perhaps, given what happens with the program, the first part of TCQ you might see it as the compliance side of the house. If you have a permit that will just transfer over from the Railroad Commission or from EPA. And so there's several reasons why we might show up at your regulated facility. It could be a regularly scheduled investigation, and that would be primarily for the individual permits that will be recognized or then granted or amended by the agency. Complaint response investigations. This is a key factor of our compliance and enforcement program, that we do respond to 100% of our complaints. And so it's a different process than the Railroad Commission. And so this is one that we'll be talking about some more with y'all, so you'll understand the parameters of complaint response of the agency. Complaints can come into us in a variety of ways, and they can also come in as anonymous. And so you might not know who the complainant is. If we go on your site under a complaint investigation, you won't get notice that we're coming onto your site. So in those cases, those are unannounced investigations that we would do, and we're usually following up in a narrow window based on the complaint information that's been provided to us, either via email, via phone call, via letter to the agency. And so that's something to be aware of. That complaint response might be different than what you're used to with the Railroad Commission. We also might go to certain sites based on initiatives, whether we don't have any planned for your group of permits that are coming over. We won't plan to visit you first thing on the list, but if there is some kind of initiative looking at specific individual permits, then you'll know that the agency is doing that, or EPA has asked us to do that as part of our agreement under grants. We could be on your site if there's a spill response or an emergency response that is occurring in the area. And so for those things, we would still continue to work with the Railroad Commission very hand in hand with part of the jurisdiction of the site that remains with them, as well as what our side might be on the discharge and where a spill might be occurring. So that's something that we do now, and it's something we'll continue to do. And we work pretty closely with the Railroad Commission. Our friends at the Railroad Commission see us quarterly, and so we have a good relationship. We hope that this transition is not something we're not coming from left field. We're definitely talking and have been meeting regularly on this transition, and we'll continue to. We could also receive referrals from county governments or other state agencies that might have gotten a complaint, have a question, and want us to look at a specific site. So these are all of the reasons that we could potentially end up at your site. Some of them would be announced. You would know we were coming. Perhaps we would ask for records ahead of time to expedite the time we're on site. But some of them might be unannounced. And in those cases, we'll definitely identify ourselves. We don't just go on your site. We try to talk to the person in charge and, again, follow the focus of what the investigation that we're on site for. So I wanted to go over just a little bit of this on the compliance side of the house. So those regularly scheduled investigations for individual permits, those folks who have EPA permits today that will be transferring, it could be on a specific schedule for us based on an agreement that we have. We do get grant dollars from the federal government, from EPA, to perform investigations in Texas. And some of those have a requirement associated with the frequency of how often we visit sites. And so as part of our outreach that we'll be doing for those different permitting buckets, when we get closer to that time, we'll be able to tell you what that schedule looks like. We also post all the checklists for those investigations, so you can actually see what questions we're going to be asking when we're on your site. And it's supposed to be a very transparent process. You know what's coming. You know about when we're coming, and the kinds of questions we're going to be asking you when we are on site. Again, those regular intervals, we are using some flexibility within our agreement with EPA on that. And so I can't give you a specific time frame at this point where your individual permits will lie. But as I said, as we are closer to the point of delegation, we will definitely talk about that so you know what permit frequency that you might be in. So these announced or unannounced. There's one other instance where unannounced. I mentioned complaint investigations. The agency also is required to do compliance history ratings for our regulated entities. It was part of a sunset review prior for the agency, and this is something that's posted and listed for each regulated entity that the agency encounters. And so dependent on that compliant history rating, you might have an unannounced regular investigation. So you might know what the checklist is, and you might know generally when to expect us at the site, but we will not coordinate with you before we go to your site. It's a very small percentage of our total regulated universe that fits into the category that would get unannounced regular inspections, but we did want to mention that as a possibility. Again, we'll have to be working as we transfer over any possible enforcement actions from the Railroad Commission and where those are in the process. So those ratings of high, satisfactory, or unsatisfactory, if you haven't been in the railroad, only been in the Railroad Commission's regulatory authority, this will be new to you in how we rate regulated entities. And we do this once a year. There's a process, and we're in it right now, where we reevaluate those ratings of regulated entities. And so we could probably spend a whole day talking about compliance history rating. We won't do that today. And we don't want it to be something that you worry about. It's something we'll work with you through and definitely have some tools that we can provide so that you understand what that means to your company and your business. So complaint response. You know, this information for us is, it's become a big part of what we do, particularly in the oil gas upstream side of our investigative house, is complaint follow-up investigations. And so this could be on anything. It could be air quality. That's what we normally go to sites, but now with this water quality function moving over, we would have a bigger universe of water quality investigations that we could potentially do under complaints on oil and gas sites. And so the information that comes to us, it can be neighbors, it can be people that are driving by a facility, that work at a facility perhaps, that they're in the local governments of where a facility is located. They can be advocacy groups that are doing their own monitoring and oversight in different areas. And so we get complaints in a whole lot of different ways. And as I mentioned, different from the Railroad Commission, we do have an anonymous category. And we will hold the anonymity of a complainant through the process. So we don't identify those, and that is something different. The Railroad Commission does identify complainants, and we do not do that. And so that will be a change. So you'll be dealing with the agency in responding to those complaints rather than working that out with a landowner or a neighbor, perhaps. Again, it usually means that there's going to be an unannounced inspection that we will be doing on site. And so we'll be going out there depending on the type of complaint that we receive. Will be dependent on how quickly we go out to the site. They get rated and they get put into different buckets as they come into the agency of how we respond to those on-site events. Again, mention the policy is we will keep complainants to ourselves throughout the process and protect them. When we look at timelines, some of the priorities for us, our highest priority, of course, is if we have a complainant on a health and safety impact that may be occurring out in the field. Those will be the highest priority for us to respond to. We do have 16 regional offices throughout the state, and those complaint investigations are initiated within those offices. So they have both a statewide hotline that they get referred calls from, as well as emails from, and they have their local number and local contacts that may trigger complaint investigations. And so they will be coming from your local areas to your facilities, and you'll be dealing with those regional offices. So as we do outreach, we'll also give you contacts of both assistants in each regional office, for you as a regulated entity to learn the ropes here at TCQ, as well as the compliance side of the house, contacts in those regional offices, 16 regional offices. So more to come on that, and more to get familiar with the agency. So we're a little different than the districts of the Railroad Commission. Of course, it would be easy if they were totally transferable, but they're not. They overlap each other, and there's different designators, so you'll have to learn a new set of what we call regional offices as opposed to district offices of the Railroad Commission. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk about compliance. I want to mention one other thing that was talked about earlier, which was our compliance initiative. Are you going to talk about that at all, Melissa? Is your plan? Not too much, okay. And so that was mentioned earlier, and knowing that that's a policy document, and we are under review right now of a revision to what initiation of any enforcement might be at the agency. And so we'll be looking at the type of violations that are similar to those that we already have on the water quality side of the house. We don't think there's going to be a lot of differences in how we treat things on the enforcement side of the house, since we already do very similar water quality work. So for those violations that might be found, we think you'll have very little difference in the criteria, but definitely it's something we're looking at through this year. That policy document will be worked through the agency, and it's something that we share online. So when we do outreach, you'll be able to talk about the newest version that's available of that document when the transfer might actually occur. So with that, I'm going to give it to Melissa.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Melissa Cordell of the Enforcement Division within the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. We administer the compliance monitoring program under the FTEs, and when necessary, we pursue formal enforcement, and which typically results in administrative orders that include corrective actions and penalties. We also administer the compliance history program, so I'll touch on that a little bit more. Our compliance monitoring program consists of a team of folks who receive and assess the compliance of discharge monitoring reports. So they don't go out into the field like the regional staff will. They'll stay inside and they'll conduct record reviews, and they'll contact facilities and determine, we'll call and find out if they're missing any DMRs, or just find out some additional information on those. They'll evaluate those record reviews and apply the enforcement initiation criteria, and typically those would be for effluent violations, if there are missing DMRs, discharging with an expired permit, and our enforcement initiation criteria that's going to be, it includes the EPA SNCC criteria as part of EPA delegation, so that's already something that we do, and we'll just be continuing to do that with these permits as well. This team will issue notices of violation and notices of enforcement for permit violations. They also provide technical and administrative support for the net DMR reporting system. So if you submit data to the TCEQ on a DMR, you must do that electronically, and if you were doing it before, you still need to do that for these permits as well. These folks also monitor the helpline and they assist in subscriptions and approve subscriber participation agreements. And they also ensure state-related data is uploaded and accurate in the federal database, so ISIS NIPDES is up to date. We have a hotline number, as I mentioned, the helpline, and so those folks are available to help, and if you go to our website, you can get that hotline number, but this is just in preparation for what's to come. So if in the situation that the region or the compliance monitoring folks determine that there are violations that rise to the level of formal enforcement, then we have some enforcement considerations. And so currently, under Texas Water Code Chapter 7, we're authorized to enforce on certain permitted activities. And then it also specifies what we need to consider in the assessment of penalties. And it also has that we have a maximum penalty may not exceed $25,000 per day per violation. And so we can, there's a lot of considerations that are laid out in the Texas Water Code. And so we apply that in our enforcement orders. And then we follow our normal TCQ enforcement process, which would be development of an administrative order with the inclusion of discussions with the respondent, and then in sending out a draft order, getting communication, coming to settlement, having a public comment period for that, having those orders come before the commission or the ED for approval, and then finalize. Now, when we're doing all of that, we are applying the commission's penalty policy. And this, the penalty policy includes a description of all those things that are mentioned before. How do we consider, how do we incorporate the factors considered for penalties, which also includes the harm and severity of violations. Excuse me. So we have a website right there where you can look and see, find our penalty policy. And so I invite you to take a look at that and also contact us if you have questions about how we apply that. As mentioned before, we have a compliance history program. And we're required under the Texas Water Code to have a system to evaluate regulated entities based on their compliance with environmental regulations. And we have the compliance history program is laid out under Texas Administrative Code Chapter 60. All persons that are subject to the requirements of the Texas Water Code Chapter 26 are applicable to compliance history. And overall, for our agency, there's 414,000 regulated entities that are in the compliance history program. Components that are incorporated, components of the compliance history program include orders, court orders, notices of violation. All of those things make up that compliance history. And as Susan mentioned, we're in the middle of it right now, so we run it every September 1st. The program, the compliance history will be posted in November. There is an appeals process, and this is all laid out on our external website. And the compliance history is required when making decisions regarding permitting, and as Susan mentioned, the announced investigation, participation in innovative programs, and enforcement. So there's a compliance history enhancement that actually gets included into the penalties assessed as well. Are there any questions on that? I'll turn it back over to David.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Melissa. And so we will place the presentation up on our website. So if you go to our TCEQ homepage, we'll see if we can get a hot link up there so it'll identify hot issues and we can link over to the presentation. I wanted to clarify something, if I could, real quick. I think there is a cap on the fees. And so when we do that link, we'll respond to that question as well, so we'll provide that response there. And in addition, we have an email set up, so if you are on your way home and you're still thinking about this, first, I'm sorry, and second, please, when you think of your question, please send it over, and we will do our best to respond back to you. It goes to the team. So our next meeting is going to be December 5th, our next stakeholder meeting, and as Laurie went over our implementation schedule, we should be well into a lot of the items and moving on those by then. And so, hopefully, I'm sure we'll be sharing more information about what we've learned, between now and then and where we are in those processes. So, any questions?
When you talk about produced water discharges, are you looking at the whole waste stream, taking that over and injection wells, or is it just surface discharges?
So our program would be for surface discharges. As far as the waste streams, I think we'd be handling them like they're handled now under 435. So the waste streams that are prohibited from discharge would remain prohibited. The waste streams that for produced water would have to meet the prohibitions that are currently in 435 on the locations that they could be discharged. We're still looking at those waste streams. Laurie L had mentioned earlier the whole delegation question, whether or not we're going to get partial delegation, and so we're still looking at that issue to figure out what to do with those other waste streams that may not fall under the definition of produced water. Did that answer your question?
So right now, you might get the injection permit from oil and gas, the railroad commission, but you discharge the service.
Correct, yeah. So we'll be handling discharge and then land application, or what we call disposal adjacent to waters in the state.
So you could anticipate that an oil and gas producer might want to treat their produced water to discharge it, and they would seek an individual permit. What about more of a commercial application? What if there's a company that says, I want to take produced water from, 17 different oil and gas producers, treat it to some certain standard and discharge it? Is there going to be a process for those more commercial applications, and will be a different from the individual permit of a particular oil and gas producer, or is that contemplated in this whole process? How would you handle that?
So that's not contemplated in this process where we're asking for delegation, but that is one of the questions that EPA was asking when they were going around talking to different states. They looked at the two guidelines that they were looking at would be the individual discharge from the E&P site that would fall under 435. 437 is what they call centralized waste treatment, where you have one facility that's receiving waste from, and it could be from several different industries, but they're required. Those regs are pretty in depth that every type of waste stream that's coming down is evaluated, and the limits are set through those effluent limitation guidelines. And so EPA is also looking at those 437 guidelines to see, okay, what kind of treatment would be required for these types of waste streams, and what would be the appropriate effluent limitations.
Is this process contemplating those 437 or only 435 or both?
So this process right now, we're going to implement what's currently in place. For 435 and 437, but those there's currently prohibitions in there, and so those would have to be revised at the federal level.
Just to make sure I'm clear on this, only the hydrostatic test waters would be eligible for under the general permit program. The produced water and the gas plant effluents would all be individual permits. There's no provision for general permit for those kinds of discharges, right?
Well, EPA has a general permit TXG 33 that covers, and correct me if I'm wrong, that covers produced water in certain locations. And so, if we were to, I think we're going to be looking to take advantage of general permits wherever we can. So if there's already an existing one, then obviously it fits the model for a general permit, and we'd be able to develop a general permit for the state that would be a one-stop shop rather than having to get a separate state and federal.
And that's for produced waters?
Potentially for produced waters under what's currently allowed, unless those are changed at a future date. Okay, Dean? So, Charles, other states that have oil and gas delegation for discharge. I know Oklahoma is currently applying for delegation, going through the process.
So none in Region 6 have delegated.
So none in Region 6 currently. Idaho may have one, and that'll be another question we'll put up on the web, a response to that. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll be around if y'all want to come by and ask questions, and I got a stack of cards I can't wait to give out.